Hi, my name is Jenny Castle, and I'm with the Rose Center for the Arts. And today I'm here talking with Renee Couture. She is an artist who is living and making work in Glide, Oregon. Renee taught at Umpqua Community College for 15 years, and now she's the visual arts coordinator for Oregon's 1% for Art program. Renee, thank you for joining with me today.
Hi, it's good to be here, there, in the virtual space.
Right, we're here together apart.
That's right.
Um, can we start by talking a little bit about your background and your path to becoming an artist?
I would say my background is rather circuitous in a lot of ways for becoming an artist. When I went to, initially when I went into undergrad, I was planning on going into art therapy. So, completely different career path than I ended up going into. Once I started taking psychology classes, I decided I really did not like psychology enough to major in it or go on for an advanced degree with anything dealing with psychology. So I decided to just switch my major to an area of study of something that really interested me, that I really enjoyed doing, that challenged me, and that I liked, right? So it was studio art, and I minored in Spanish and women's studies. And I can say that I was really fortunate with that, that my parents, even though, because everybody has the parents, what are you going to do with that degree? My parents never said that. And I feel really fortunate that I never had to have that conversation with them, that they just sort of let me, not that they let me, I was paying for my own school, so like they could say anything about it, but that they didn't pressure me into a career path that they felt was more safe or secure. um, and I don't know if it was just because it was a different time, but I'm just very happy that I just studied what I loved and what I was curious about, and that there was that I was able to do that. After college, I had no idea really what I wanted to do with my life, but what I did know is that I didn't want to work in an office. That was the one thing I knew that I didn't want, so I just didn't do it. Um, and I ended up wanting to travel and finding ways of traveling. So I was an AmeriCorps volunteer for a year. If you don't really know what you want to do after college, think about that. Then after AmeriCorps, I worked on this goat dairy up in the mountains of west central New Mexico, off the grid. After that, I joined the Peace Corps and traveled to my host country. After Peace Corps, I traveled around South America, and then finally made it back to the United States and decided that that I had some unfinished business with art, that I was still really interested in making art, and but ultimately knowing that, gosh, I had so much growing that I needed to do, and went for the MFA. Um, and and then some other things fell into place, and all the while teaching making art, because so many artists have jobs and have their studio practice, unless you're one of those unicorn artists that just find a way to make your living off of your art, in which case kudos to you you are able to do that. So that was my route. It was just, it wasn't a straight line.
Yeah.
At all.
So when you talk about coming back from all these travels and life experiences and returning to your art practice, um, what were some driving forces that returned you back to maybe a more regimented art practice and have carried you through because you're still making work. So, I mean, what do you think drives you?
I think just questions and curiosity. I think that we should never underestimate the power of curiosity and where that can take us and how that can lead us into reading books that we thought we'd never read, like reading a book on the history of barbed wire. Never thought I'd do that, right? But but will lead you to places and to asking questions, and it's that process of answering the questions, trying to answer the questions, that ultimately is what becomes the work, right? The work is the visual interpretation of answers, or trying to answer something, I guess.
Can you talk a little bit more about reading a book on the history of barbed wire and then ultimately how that helped you create an art piece that answered a question for you? I think that would be a really interesting anecdote for students.
Right. So I was really starting to become aware of boundaries and borders. And in the context of my life, just thinking about how kind of an invisible line, this line that we don't always see unless there's a fence there, of course, can dictate who can go where, what can be done on a piece of land that is, you know, 1 inch to the left, you can do some things, and 1 inch to the right, you can't, right? Who can go places, how we can move through space. And so part of that was this history of settling the West, and that role of the grid across the landscape, the role of fencing areas, and that, for a lot of history in the United States with land grabs and different sort of acts that, like such as the Homestead Act, or that were based on the Homestead Act, this idea of improvement. People had to improve, quote unquote, the land, and that improvement always meant some sort of human intervention and generally some sort of agricultural practice, which is pretty interesting. I mean, to the point where even as it relates to within the Pacific Northwest, clear cutting to farm, when makes more sense to grow trees here instead of cutting trees to farm, as what had happened. So yeah, just reading different histories, different stories. And part of it too was wanting to understand the place where I lived, the place that I moved to, because I moved to the Pacific Northwest from the Midwest. And so how is this landscape political? And really wanting to understand where I lived. And so that led to a lot of interviewing people, a lot of reading. And so that's where I say curiosity can lead you to reading things that you didn't, or watching movies, or talking to people that you maybe didn't think you would.
So you've been making art since undergrad. Your whole life you've been inspired to make art. And can you point to specific artists that have influenced your work and maybe helped you shift in ways that were more meaningful in your art practice?
So I think, and she is somebody that kind of, probably so many people, I don't know how old you are, but probably women of my generation. But Eva Hess, of course, because she was so fearless, or outwardly fearless with how she experimented with media, I think is just something that my work is nothing like hers, but I think it's just her level of experimentation and curiosity, but then also how she would use, in some ways, these sort of formal approaches like repetition to create unity within the work. So I love her work. I love Bruce Naumann's work too, because I think there's humor in his work. And I wish I was a funny artist. I wish I was a funny, but I'm not. And I feel like I'm always so serious, and I would love to be a funny artist, and I think that his work is quite funny. And again, there's this sort of freedom in his work, and this sort of attitude, right, where he asked himself, or he decided that he was an artist, and so anything he did in the studio was art. I mean, talk about creating space to be able to be risky within your work. I mean, how wonderful. So I love Bruce Nauman. I love Doris Salcedo, of course, because her work is so poetic. I also love the impossibility of her work, the sort of labor intensity of her work, the how did that happen? How did she do that within her work? Of course, she has a studio filled with people too, but to help her make all this stuff happen. But the ideas are, that she has and how she wants to visually represent things. I think that there's so much space there for the viewer. And there's so many questions that her work allows the viewer to ask, even if it's like, what is up with this? And that's a starting place of a question, right? And then hopefully the questions go beyond that. As far as artists within the Pacific Northwest, I love the work of Tanaz Farsi. I love the work of Natalie Ball and of Avankita Bawa. A lot of female artists, and I don't know if that's because I'm a female. I hope not. I think their work is just really great. I hope if I were a guy that I would also like their work equally. but but I don't know. But there is a sense of the way that the gesture, I think, within their work, in some ways, the way that they're using materials within their work, the way that they're thinking and representing, that I find really compelling. So those are my faves.
Faves. Thank you for sharing that. No, you kept using words like freedom and space, and the fact that that's what you love about these other people who you admire. And it resonated with me because I feel like, especially after completing a graduate program, that, trying to allow yourself freedom and space and room for error can be difficult. And so finding artists that do that, it seems like they do it effortlessly when in fact maybe they don't, can definitely bring some inspiration. And that moves us into my next question, which is like, what type of advice would you give for young artists who are trying to make their way in the world and include art in their life despite having other responsibilities and busy lives?
I would say that, it's hard work. Just being honest here. It's really hard work to carve that time out for yourself. Especially with all the responsibilities that that we often have to juggle. And so you just have to find that space. You have to find a way to dedicate that time, whether it's marking it on your day planner, these 2 hours in my studio. I think it's easier if you have, and we create patterns in our life, but if you can create a pattern in your life to facilitate your practice, that can be really, really helpful. So that's finding the mental space, which can be hard, always carrying your sketchbook, always just looking around you. I think a lot about art if I'm in the shower, thinking about a project, on a walk, thinking about a project. So those are, you know, and Andrea Zattel talks about that a lot, where she discusses this in one of her books of voids and avoids. And so an avoid would be like watching TV, listening to music, a podcast. A void is a space where you're just sort of free to allow your mind to wander. And so that could be in your car with the radio off. I love driving my car with the radio off, the silence, or going on a walk and just letting your mind wander. Those are important moments. Don't underestimate those. I think that take risks, be curious. Those are two really important things. There was one other one. Oh, I had it on the tip of my tongue, and then I said those other things, and now I've completely forgot. Oh, be tenacious. You know, you have to be tenacious, and a bit of stubbornness will do you well, because things will fall apart, and you have to sometimes cry and swear and then start over and do that. You know, give yourself 5 minutes of crying and swearing and then start over. That's
That's how you keep moving forward.
that's how you keep moving forward. Yeah, that is, because otherwise we just be like puddles on the floor, and you will be a puddle on the floor sometimes.
Temporarily.
Temporary, yeah, make it temporary, and then pick yourself back up, take a deep breath, and sort of do a dissection of what happened, and then move on.
Renee,
Yeah.
thank you so much for talking with me today. Renee Couture is part of a group show at the Forsberg Art Gallery this fall entitled A Quiet Stand. Renee, thank you again.
Thanks, Jenny. Bye.